Welcome back. I'm Kim Bailey and this is Floral Art Review. Now this week, rather than a competition design of mine, I'm using a design that I demonstrated for a gardening club where I had done the judging of the floral art prior to doing the demonstration for them during their meeting time. And this was to highlight for them what it means to use water as part of your design. So the magnifying effect that has, and also about a few drawbacks about using glass containers. So the title that they gave me for the demonstration was Within a Tall Glass Container. So obviously they could see what I was doing, and it was glass, and it was quite a challenge for me because I had to think about how I could demonstrate the things that I wanted them to think about, as well as come up with a design that was reasonably attractive to look at, because these sorts of things usually get raffled off at the end of the time. So I wanted it to be something that someone could take away and study and learn about. So what I've done here is I've used a glass vase that flares out a little bit at the top. On the bottom of the glass vase and around the rim of the vase, I've put some very thin cork strip, so it comes like an adhesive and you can bend it. It's reasonably malleable. That does tend to break a little bit, so I try to just only use it where I know I've got a reasonable width to bend it over. So that was at the top and at the base of the vase itself. I've got some corks that I've placed up against the rim, and they're actually attached to one another with a wire. The wire runs through them, so it gives me a little circle, a little wreath of corks, and some coconut fibre to fill in the top. And they're sitting on top of the water. As you can see, the bottom of the corks is just touching the top of the water. And I've got a couple of corks further down at the base of the design. The vase itself is sitting on a slice of Banksia tree, and that was to incorporate the colours, because if you think about it, and I've talked about it before, if this was sitting flat on the bench, on that white bench, then it wouldn't look anywhere near as interesting a design as it is by being lifted up away from the white and having that colour reinforced. It also means that you can look through the vase and see the base at the back, so it gives you a little bit more depth to the design as well. With the foliage, I've just used some rosemary and some Banksia leaves. I didn't try to put any flowers in. With using flowers in a submerged design, you need to make sure that there are flowers that are going to be able to tolerate that. So roses can do it, dahlias, chrysanthemums. A lot of the very standard flowers can do it, but you also need to remember how much more magnified they are when they're in water. So it's always going to look much bigger. So you need a lot less in terms of filling the design. So that said, let's see what our design eye has got to say about a very strict analysis of this design based on the principles and elements of design. Looking at line, first of all, strong vertical lines dominate this design, reinforced by the tall glass container and the upright placement of materials. Internal stems and corks echo this verticality, guiding the eye upward and creating a sense of quiet strength and containment. So what we wanted to do, when you look at that title, it says within a tall glass container. So really you need to ensure that everything that you do in your design is contained within the container. So if this was a competition piece, then I would probably lose marks for the corks being above the edge of the glass vase. That also needs to be well and truly contained within the glass container. So that would be something I'd look at in terms of a competition. But for this demonstration, it gives a sense of how you place the plant material within that design to reinforce that verticality, which I've done here. But it also means that you have to think about the form of the plant material itself. So you couldn't have anything that was too rounded in terms of its shape, because that's going to take away from the verticality of the design itself. So let's talk about form. The form is cylindrical and contained, mirroring the vessel itself. All materials respect the internal boundaries of the glass, resulting in a disciplined architectural composition that feels intentional rather than decorative. So it was very intentional, and that was very intentional for a purpose, to show how you would use these principles and elements of design within a container, within the constraints of a container, because often these days there are competition class titles where you are required to be within a framework or within a space, and you really need to start thinking about how your design is going to work within that fencing, if you like, those outside limits of the design space itself. Looking at space, this design makes thoughtful use of internal space. The transparent container allows the viewer to see how negative and positive space interact inside the vessel. Air gaps between the materials prevent overcrowding and create visual clarity. So this is where I was talking about, be very careful if you're using water as the medium and you're doing an underwater design, to not put too much in, because you need that space that's going to be magnified. It's going to take up more space visually than you expect. So be mindful of that when you're actually doing the placements. Texture. Texture is subtly layered rather than bold. Smooth glass contrasts with rough cork surfaces, fibrous coconut husk, soft foliage and coarse timber base. These understated textures reward close inspection and reinforce the natural theme. So where in the past, many of my designs, as you would know if you've looked at any of the videos, I do rely on texture to be the contrasting feature within a design. This one I had to be a little bit more mindful of how I was going to do that contrast. And this is something that happens with a glass container, because a glass container can be very dominant, not just because it's glass and it's shiny, but because it dominates visually anything else that you put with it, unless you break it up a little bit. So what I've done there is broken up the glass surface by having the cork rim at the top and at the base, by having the corks themselves inside that rim, so it breaks up that edge as well. Corks at the base, so it breaks up the base. Having, as I said, the slice of Banksia underneath it, so that you are drawn to that as the dominant point or the focal point or an area of interest, rather than the glass being what draws your eye first of all. Colour. The palette is restrained and harmonious, featuring muted greens, warm beiges, soft browns and natural cork tones. The limited colour range supports unity and allows texture and structure to take precedence. And this was part of what I needed to do for this demonstration, was that I needed to show the structure. I needed to show, as is my way, the texture and textural qualities that you can bring into a design where one texture might have the potential to be more dominant than others. And I like to keep it to those neutral and muted colours, so that the focus of this learning experience, this demonstration, wasn't about making a pretty design. It was about understanding what you can do when you are limited with the structure that you have to use for a particular design. So value and tone. Mid to light tones dominate, with darker accents provided by cork and foliage. The tonal consistency maintains calm and balance while still offering sufficient contrast for definition. So if you can imagine, had I put anything else that was a little bit more vibrant, so even a yellow, it's going to take away, changes the dynamic of the design completely, and it would look out of place. It needs to be those complementary muted colours to actually work with the design structure that I've put together. Pattern. A pattern emerges through repetition of corks at the top, rim and recurring organic shapes inside the container. This repetition adds rhythm without overpowering the minimal aesthetic. So pattern is about rhythm, and it's about making sure that there is something that your eye can match up with. So we can see, as it says, the cork, the repetition of the cork and the plant material inside. I think, if I look at it now, the plant material needs a little bit more refinement inside, and it might just have been that the photo was taken whilst I was in the midst of doing the demonstration. But I do think that for a competition piece, I would think a lot more about the placement of the foliage within the container, just so there was a little bit more rhythm within that water area underneath the corks. Balance. The design achieves symmetrical balance, with materials evenly distributed around the central axis. The visual weight is well grounded by the solid timber base, providing stability to the vertical composition. So we've got good visual base and weight, and we've got a symmetrical balance in the design. And if you've looked at any of the other videos, you'll know this is the first time I've had symmetrical balance, because mostly I work with asymmetrical balance. That's just my preferred design style. But with this one, it's symmetrical balance because we've got a round container, we've got everything contained within the container, and so it needs to be, because of that verticality, it needs to be balanced within the container, and that then gives us the symmetrical balance over the whole of the design. Dominance and focal area. The focal emphasis sits at the rim of the container, where the corks and fibrous material create a visual pause. This framing naturally draws attention before leading the eye downward into the interior narrative. Now, you see, as I mentioned earlier, I think that the base is somewhat more dominant than the top of the design, but I think they work together. I think it sort of gives you a sandwich of, here is the top and the bottom of the design, and look at what's in the middle. So it's still, as it says, it still frames the design, top and bottom. But I do think that, for me anyway, that the base draws me more so than the top, even though they're very similar in colour and shape and size. Contrast. Contrast is achieved through transparent versus opaque, smooth versus rough, rigid glass versus organic materials. These contrasts enhance interest while remaining subtle and cohesive. So it's a little bit like textural contrast. The contrast can sometimes be in texture, it can be in colour, it can be in the line as well. But what we've got here is a number of areas where there is contrast, but nothing overwhelms the rest of the design. So it's good in that sense that it still remains cohesive even with the contrasts. Rhythm and movement. The eye moves vertically from the wooden base through the layered interior and up to the textured rim. Repetition of forms creates a gentle, steady rhythm rather than dynamic movement. So if you looked at some of the other design, you'll see that a lot of them have dynamic movement, because I like to work with plant material that's been sculptured by nature, and so that often has dynamic movement in it. But this one is a little bit less dynamic. It's a little bit, as it says, a little bit gentler, and it's a general repetition that gives you that rhythm, and it's rhythm more than it is movement, if you can see the difference. So there's rhythm in the fact that there's repetition, and that then makes you move through the design. So there's, rather than any one element in the design creating the movement of the design. Proportion. Proportions are well resolved. The height of the container is balanced by the depth of internal materials and the width of the timber base, preventing the design from feeling top heavy. So this was another thing that I talked to the group about when I was doing the demonstration, is that it is very much a challenge to think about proportions of plant material when you're working underwater, because, as I've said all along, the plant material that you put under the water gets enlarged and it gets magnified. So keeping those proportions right, I think I was helped by the fact that I wanted to frame it top and bottom. So I've got the frame at the bottom, I've got the frame at the top, and that meant that it disciplined me into only putting a very minimal amount of plant material to keep it in proportion with that framing that I've set myself to do. Scale. The scale feels intimate yet sculptural, suitable for exhibition or close viewing. The transparent container invites engagement from all angles. So interesting that, although it was going to be judged from the front, you still need to have that implied depth in the design, and that comes back to the scale of the materials that you're using. And once again, with the magnification that the water causes, we've got to think about the scale of plant material to one another within the design. Harmony and unity. Unity is achieved through consistent material choice, restrained colour, and respect for the container's form. Every element feels purposeful and aligned with the design intent. So it is a unified design. I think that it probably lacks a little bit of harmony in the placements internally. And now, the more I look at it, the more I feel like there should be, I couldn't do it, but I would like to see something of the foliage on the outside of the container, but that would go against what the class title was. And so we need to recognise that that's the class title. It's contained within the tall glass container, and leave it at that. It's harmonious in terms of the class title, if not a particular design. So let's look now at some of the suggestions to improve this into a competition piece. Number one, increase internal depth by introducing one element slightly closer to the glass wall to enhance spatial layering. Now that's what I tried to do with the corks that are in the base of the container, but they're at the back, and I think what it's suggesting is that I should have perhaps one angled slightly, so one more towards the front and one more towards the back, so that I was looking through the design. What that would also give me is some negative space between them where I could see the base, and so I would have that base enhancing the depth of the design. So that's certainly something I would try. Number two, refine the focal area by varying cork heights or spacing to create more deliberate rhythm at the rim. I probably couldn't adjust the heights because that's going to affect, I'm thinking about it as I talk. As I said, if we want to keep it within the class title, which is within the tall glass container, then at the top of those corks should be at the top of the rim of the vase. But I could space them out a bit more. I could have a gap in between each one. So because it's still leaning up against a cork rim, it's going to give me the ability to see through the design, give me that negative space, and enhance the overall feel of where the focal area might be, which I think is going to be at the base. I think if I start to take corks out of the top, then the base is going to be that focal area, going to be drawn to that base first and then go up the design. Not that it matters one way or the other, but I think that's what would happen if I followed this suggestion. Number three, enhance vertical movement with subtle upward reaching foliage line to emphasise height. I think that's probably a very good suggestion. What I've done with that foliage is I've circled it within the container itself, and although there is one vertical upright placement, it's a little bit hard to see because it's caught in the middle of the circular part of the foliage, so I'd have to refine that a little bit more, maybe spiral the more dense foliage from the base to the top, so that once again we're using that negative space and the water within the container and still have the one upright that was heading towards the top of the vase. Number four, clarify the narrative by limiting one internal material, allowing another to take clearer visual dominance. So this is a little bit, reflects back on the previous one as well. So I've got two types of foliage in there, and what I really need to do, I think, is limit it to one type of foliage and have it, I think, as I said, the spiral with another piece of it coming straight up vertically through the centre would help the design in terms of it being a competition piece rather than a demonstration piece. So there we have a different design to have a look at, one that was not as constrained by competition thinking as many of the other designs in this video series. It gives you an idea of how you can have any of your own designs, whether they're for competition or not, analysed and get some feedback and learn about things that you could do and try, and think more directly about how you're putting your designs together, what you're using to put your designs together, incorporating the mechanics that you have to use for a design, so the water becomes a mechanic of sorts because it's using the plant material, is using it to float within that container. Thinking about containers, thinking about the appropriateness of certain containers for certain designs. All of those things help you on your floral art journey. So I encourage you to have a go. All you need to do is upload an image, follow the instructions on the website, and within about 24 hours you'll have your analysis back. It is looked at by a human judge as well, just to make sure that we're giving you information that is useful for you to be learning from. But with that, I will leave you for this week. I'm Kim Bailey, and this is Floral Art Review.